The Dryford stage stop was usually quiet in the mornings, but today the platform was crowded. Merrick stood by the weathered post that marked the stop, one hand resting loosely at his belt, his eyes unreadable. The southbound coach rolled in, red dust curling up like a low fog. When the door swung open, Naomi Blake stepped down, her back straight, her dark eyes bright, showing no trace of fear. A black woman, in a town full of prejudice, looked him square in the eye and asked, without hesitation, "So you're my new man?" The words cut into the tense, hushed air like a blade. A scoff broke the silence, followed by a low whistle, a few muttered remarks tinged with bitterness. The scents of tanned leather, coffee, and sun-dried hay drifted with the road dust, hanging in the air as if to keep the moment suspended. Cole didn't answer right away. He studied her, weighing something deeper than the question itself. The two of them stood there, caught between two tides, the town's prejudice and the woman's pride. And from that moment on, Dryford would have a new story to tell, though no one yet knew just how much it would change everything. Dryford, summer in 1885. The Dryford stage stop was rarely crowded in the morning. It was nothing more than a square of hard-packed gravel, wedged between a row of low, weather-beaten storefronts and the dust-heavy main road that stretched out toward the wide, unbroken prairie. But today, it seemed the whole town had found an excuse to linger. Some stood beneath the awning of Henderson's General Store. Some leaned against the hitch rail in front of Dalton's saloon. Others perched on the sill of McAllister's blacksmith shop. Every eye was fixed on the same spot, the point where the southbound stage would soon appear. Merrick stood there, right beside the weathered post marking the stop, one hand resting lightly at his belt, in the manner of a man who had spent years in a place where a few slow seconds could cost a life. Not because he feared being shot, but because the habit made him appear calm, kept anyone from knowing what was turning over inside his head. Today, he found it harder to keep that calm than usual. The early wind swept up the red dust from the road, curling it around people's boots, clinging to trouser cuffs and coat hems. The smell of tanned leather, the dry sweetness of hay from the livery down the street, and the sharp aroma of coffee from the cafe across the way, all mixed into the familiar scent of Dryford. But inside Cole, nothing felt familiar at all. From a distance came the steady clop of hooves. The Wells Fargo coach came into view, dark gold, its wheels dulled gray by miles of road dust. The horses blew hard, sending white plumes of breath into the pale morning light. The driver was an old man Cole knew by sight, but had never spoken to, the kind who spent a lifetime crossing the West, yet never belonged anywhere. The coach slowed, then drew to a stop at the post. A cloud of dust rose, hanging in the air before drifting down like a curtain. Cole narrowed his eyes, looking through it. The door swung open. The first to step down was a heavy-set merchant with a bulging leather valise. Then came a middle-aged couple carrying small satchels, their eyes wary at the sight of the crowd. And then, when the murmurs had just begun to fade, the fourth passenger appeared in the doorway. Naomi Blake. She stepped down slowly, the heels of her boots striking the gravel with a dry, precise sound. Her dress was pale gray cotton, plain but clean down to the last fold. Her black hair was pinned neatly, showing the length of her neck, and a face fine-boned yet unyielding. The first thing Cole noticed wasn't her skin, though that, in this town, would be the first thing everyone else saw, but the way she stood straight, as if years of dust and stairs had never managed to bend her spine. Her gaze swept over the faces turned toward her, then stopped on him. There was no trace of uncertainty, no gratitude, no relief, just a direct, bright, measuring look, as though she were weighing the man in front of her. Then she spoke, her voice even, but carrying enough for the entire platform to hear. "So you're my new man." In that moment, it was as if someone had tossed a stone into a still pond. Murmurs rippled out instantly, spreading through the crowd. There was a sharp snort, a low, mocking laugh, the quick whistle of someone trying to draw attention. A knot of young men under Dalton's awning elbowed each other, leaning close to whisper before breaking into grins. Cole didn't answer right away. He only looked at her, eyes unreadable, as if searching for something behind the question. He knew every person in that crowd was waiting for his response, and every one of them would have their own version of this moment by the time the whiskey came out tonight. Across the street, Mrs. Henderson from the general store bent toward her companion to whisper in her ear. The men on the blacksmith's sill spat into the dirt and shook their heads like they'd just witnessed a fool's errand. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts, wide-eyed, too young to understand but old enough to feel the strange weight in the air. Naomi didn't take the question back. She simply stood there, hand firm on the strap of her cloth bag, her eyes steady. What Cole saw in them wasn't defiance. It was a kind of cold composure. The sort a person learns after walking through more than a few ugly moments without letting them take anything away. He gave a small nod, not smiling, not scowling, and stepped toward her, his boots crunching the gravel under the sigh of wind curling dust through the platform. People shifted aside, clearing a path without taking their eyes off them. When they stood face to face, Cole knew he was caught between two tides. One, the hard prejudice of the town. The other, the steady self-respect of this woman pressing toward him. And he knew, willing or not, they'd been bound together in a story Dryford would be telling for a long time. He held out his hand, not to shake hers, but to take the bag. She hesitated a heartbeat before letting it go, saying nothing. It was a small thing, but Cole knew it carried more than a token of burden. It was a test, to see what the man before her would do with the weight she'd placed in his hands. The crowd began to thin, people drifting away though still glancing back. The last gust of morning wind lifted the red dust, covering their footprints on the gravel. Cole turned and motioned for Naomi to follow. Behind them, the sound of hooves faded down the road, leaving the town to settle back into its daily rhythm. Though for the two of them, nothing would be the same after the moment she stepped down from that stage. The night before, Dalton's saloon burned bright with lamplight. But what truly filled the room was the smoke, thick enough to cut with a knife. The heavy scent of whiskey tangled with sweat and tanned leather until the air felt dense, almost chewable. Inside, scratched wooden tables, blotched with old cigarette burns, held clusters of men, some laughing in coarse bursts, some talking low through clenched teeth, others silently staring down the cards face down before them. Cole Merrick stood in the doorway, eyes sweeping the room. He wasn't a regular here, not because he feared liquor or the turn of the cards, but because places like this had a way of swallowing a man's evening whole, and he'd never found that worth the trade. But tonight, the emptiness in his pocket and the sight of the bay stallion limping in his corral forced his hand. The loss of its custom-fitted shoe wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a costly problem, and if he didn't see to it, tomorrow's delivery would fail. He stepped inside, the noise dipping a beat as a few heads turned his way. Cole wasn't a man who sought attention, but his reputation, as both a successful cattleman and a man whose word held, was enough to draw it. In the far corner, Silas Crow sat with one leg crossed over the other, black suit cut sharp, silver hair combed back to a polished shine. When he looked up and saw Cole, a slow smile spread across his face, the kind a man gives when he spots a big fish drifting close to the hook. "Care to sit in, Merrick?" His voice carried just enough for the players at his table to pause their game and glance over. Cole gave a small nod, pulled out a chair, and set his hat on the edge of the table. The chips in front of each man were stacked in modest towers. Cole slid the last coins from his pocket across the felt, trading them for a small, unremarkable pile. Enough to play, not enough to make anyone consider him a threat. The first few hands passed without flair. Cole wasn't a seasoned card sharp, but he knew how to keep his face flat as pine, showing nothing. Sometimes he folded early. Sometimes he stayed in to the end. Luck and patience worked in quiet tandem, slowly pushing his stack higher. Silas, confident in the tricks that had served him well before, began to lose the ease in his posture. By the time the game had whittled down to just the two of them, the others either broke or drifted away to watch. The air at the table had changed. Conversation from the rest of the saloon blurred into a distant hum. Only the snap of cards hitting felt, and the ticking of the wall clock seemed close. Cole laid down 2 pair without a change in expression. Silas stared at the hand, his mouth twitching like he'd swallowed a curse. His stack had shrunk so much it could be scooped up in a single hand. He smiled, but it was the smile of a man looking for a door, not one who'd just found a win. "Seems I'm a little short on funds tonight," he said, dragging the words, eyes catching a gleam of calculation. "But I've got something else, worth more than these chips." Cole was ready to refuse. All he wanted was cash, and to be on his way. But Silas tilted his head, letting the words drop into the space between them like a stone into a well. "A woman, colored, educated, reads and writes better than most men in here." For a heartbeat, the table went dead silent. Then came the laughter, loud, raw, and mean. Someone slapped the table. Another gave a long, low whistle. A voice from the bar called out, "Might as well trade for cattle." Heat surged in Cole's chest, but he showed nothing. He knew the unspoken rules in a place like this. Refuse and you walked away broke, losing not just your winnings but a scrap of your standing. The crowd would tell it over and over, each time adding a little more bite. Slowly, he set his hand over his chips, eyes locked on Silas. He didn't speak, just gave a single steady nod. The room roared, voices a mix of shock and delight, hungry for the spectacle they thought was coming. Silas leaned back and waved for paper and ink. He scribbled quickly, signed his name, and slid the sheet across the table. A so-called certificate of ownership he'd just turned into a stake in the game. Cole glanced at it, not touching it. When the game was settled, Silas scraped together his last chips, pushed back his chair, and rose. But before leaving, Cole caught him angle his head toward a dark corner, toward a man who had sat silent all night. They exchanged a small envelope, the kind passed with purpose. The stranger slipped it into his coat and walked out the back door. Cole watched him go, saying nothing. He didn't know what was in that envelope, but the way it had changed hands, quiet, quick, tugged at old instincts from army briefings, the kind meant for ears that didn't belong to the general public. And in that moment, without knowing why, he felt it. Tonight's game wasn't over, not by a long mile, and the price of that last hand would be far steeper than the chips left on the table. Cole led Naomi away from the stage stop, along the main road, that cut straight through Dryford. The early wind carried the resinous scent of pine from the sawmill, tinged with the faint, scorched bite from McAllister's forge. Red dust rose in small swirls with every step, clinging to the hem of Naomi's gray dress, but she didn't bother to brush it away. They walked side by side, far enough apart to avoid the press of closeness, but not close enough to be called company. Since leaving the platform, Cole had spoken only once. "My place is on the edge of town, near a creek." Naomi had kept to absolute silence. The road out toward the edge passed rows of weather-worn clapboard houses, their tin roofs ticking softly in the sun. Each time they passed a porch, eyes peeked from behind curtains or through the narrow cracks of a door, then vanished quickly, as if afraid to be caught looking. In a place like this, news traveled faster than hoofbeats, and within minutes the whole town would know Cole Merrick had walked a black woman from the stage into his keeping. Cole's house sat on a neat square of land about half a mile from town. The siding had gone gray under years of wind and sun, but the boards held tight. The porch was swept clean, with a few pots of red geraniums set beside the steps. Out back stood the barn, roof weathered but sound, the smell of fresh hay drifting from within. He opened the door and stepped aside for Naomi to enter first. Inside, the place was orderly, stripped of anything unnecessary. A square wooden table with 4 chairs, a small bookshelf pressed to the wall holding a few Bibles and books on farming, a black iron stove in the corner. The late afternoon light spilled through the lone window, tracing the fine motes of dust that hung in the air. "You'll take the back room," Cole said, voice neutral, neither an order nor an invitation. "I sleep out here near the stove." He set her bag down on the floor, then left the room without another glance. Naomi stood a moment, taking in the space before closing the door softly behind her. In the days that followed, silence settled over the house like a thick, low fog. Mornings, Cole left early to work on neighboring ranches. By the time he returned in the late afternoon, Naomi had the evening meal ready, but their exchanges were limited to bare phrases. "Do you need anything?" "No." "Quiet day?" "Same as always." No quarrels, no warmth, just a distance both seemed to keep as an unspoken rule. Naomi rarely went out, except when necessary. The first time she went to town alone, Dryford showed her the cold edge of its manners. Stepping into Henderson's general store, she greeted the shopkeeper with steady politeness. Mrs. Henderson looked her over from head to toe, lips pressed tight, and went on stacking goods as if she hadn't heard. Naomi repeated her request for sugar and flour. Still no answer. Only when Cole walked in a few minutes later did Mrs. Henderson look up and ask, "What can I get you?" "What she just said," Cole replied. At that, the woman quickly packed the order and handed it to him without once meeting Naomi's eyes. It happened again in other shops, people speaking to Cole about Naomi as if she weren't standing right there. That evening, Naomi set the parcels on the table, removed her headscarf, and said nothing. Cole stood in the doorway, thought about speaking, then let it go. Any apology now would only be a ripple across the taut surface of a pond. The townsfolk didn't stop at cold civility. Once, passing the public well, a group of children tossed small pebbles at her legs before scattering in a fit of giggles. The grown-ups nearby made no move to stop them. A few even smiled. Every glance, every turned back, was another dull knife, cutting slow but deep. Naomi gave no reaction. Her head stayed slightly lifted, her pace steady, as if she neither heard nor saw. Silence, for her, seemed less a lack of words than a kind of armor, the only shield she had against the harshness of this place. Cole began to realize it was that very silence that unsettled him most. It wasn't the silence of fear or submission, but one chosen, deliberately, like a way of keeping a part of herself no one could touch. He'd seen people forced to live under contempt. They either lashed out loud or bent quietly to it. Naomi was different. She had built a wall, tall, straight, and allowed no one to see over it. One morning as Cole was heading out, he saw her standing at the window, hand resting on the wooden frame, eyes fixed on the empty stretch of field beyond. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, but something in her stillness struck him as both resolute and adrift. He thought of asking, but instead he set his hat, pulled on his gloves, and walked out the door. In Dryford, talk of the prize Cole had won off Silas Crow still made the rounds. At the saloon, some joked Naomi was nothing but trouble in boots, that Cole would regret keeping her. A few cowhands told him flat out, "The longer you keep her, the less folks'll think of you." Cole never answered, but their words plucked at a tight cord inside him, a cord whose breaking point he didn't yet know. And so the days went on. The wall of silence between them didn't crumble, but it didn't thicken either. It simply stood, a quiet boundary waiting for something strong enough to change its shape. Cole didn't yet know that, given the right moment, that wall would open a door, and he would be the first to see it. That afternoon, the sky carried the dull gold of a waning sun. Cole came back earlier than usual, his saddle still dusted from the long road. He'd meant to stop by the barn first to check on Redwind, the strongest mare he owned, but as he neared the backyard, a sight made him pause mid-step. Naomi was standing beside Redwind. The mare held one front leg lifted, balancing on the other three, her head dipping lightly with each breath. Her ears were pricked, but her eyes had softened, stripped of the tension they usually carried when strangers came too close. Naomi knelt on one knee, the hem of her gray dress fanning out across the dirt, both hands loosely supporting the horse's ankle. In front of her sat a small wooden basin filled with dark liquid that carried the sharp, earthy scent of herbs. Spread on a cloth beside it were several fresh leaves, a glass jar of white powder, and a slim-bladed knife. Her movements were slow and sure as she examined the hoof. Each time her fingers pressed, the mare's muscles flickered but never lashed out. Cole could see, even from where he stood, the red swelling near the cleft of the hoof. He frowned. Redwind had been sound that morning. What happened to her? His voice was low but clear enough to carry. Naomi looked up, her expression steady. A small stone lodged in the cleft. Left there but it would have turned septic. I've taken it out. Cole stepped forward for a closer look, but Naomi's hand lifted, gentle yet firm. Don't throw her off balance. Let me finish. He stayed where he was, watching as she rinsed the wound with the herbal wash, then used the knife to scrape away the dirt around it. She scooped up a pinch of green paste from the crushed leaves, mixed it with a measure of the white powder from the jar, added a few drops of water until it formed a thick salve, and spread it carefully over the swelling. What's that? Cole asked. Disinfectant and pain relief, she said, eyes never leaving her work. Sage leaves and willow bark. The white powder is borax. It keeps the wound dry and clean. She wrapped the hoof with clean cloth, tying it snug enough to hold but loose enough not to choke the blood flow. When she was done, she smoothed Redwind's mane and murmured, "Good girl." Cole could see the change in the mare. Redwind was notoriously difficult. He sometimes had to steady her with his voice alone to keep her from fighting the halter. Yet here she stood, quiet, eyes half-lidded, as if the touch was something she welcomed. "Where'd you learn that?" Cole's voice was even, but curiosity edged it. Naomi rose, brushing the dust from her dress. "From a doctor in New Orleans." "A doctor? Taught you to doctor horses?" "Not just horses." Her eyes met his for a brief, unguarded moment before she looked away. "He taught me to care for people and animals both." Cole waited, hoping she'd continue, but she bent to gather her tools, packing them neatly into a cloth bag. The conversation shut as quickly as it had opened. He wanted to ask why a woman like her had ended up as the stakes in a card game. He wanted to know more about that doctor, about her life before Dryford, but instinct told him, push, and she'd raise the wall higher. On his way back into the house, Cole kept replaying what he'd seen. It wasn't just the method, more refined than what most horsemen in town knew, but the way she carried herself through it. Every move held the calm precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and why. In all their days under the same roof, this was the first time Cole felt that Naomi wasn't merely enduring the town, but might, if she chose, be able to change it. That evening, as he cleared the table, Naomi set a glass of water in front of him. "Let Redwind rest a few days. If she moves stiff, I'll change the dressing." Cole took the glass, nodding once. No words of thanks came, not because he didn't feel them, but because between them, such words still felt foreign. Instead, his gaze lingered longer than usual, a quiet acknowledgement in its own right. Naomi didn't wait for an answer. She left the table with the same straight-backed stillness she'd carried the day she stepped down from the stagecoach. Outside, Redwind's hoofbeats fell soft and even in the stall, surer than they'd been that morning. Cole knew, because of those hands, the mare would soon be sound again. And he was beginning to understand. There were things Naomi had brought into this town that Silas Crow had never imagined. Things that could turn every whispered story on its head. Barely a week after the afternoon Naomi had tended Redwind, Dryford changed completely. Gone was the pale gold sunlight and the slow, steady rhythm of town life. In its place hung an air thick with the smell of worry. The first news came on Monday morning. The Dawson family's youngest boy, only 6, had spiked a high fever and was vomiting violently. By noon, 2 more children from the North End showed the same symptoms. Cole heard it while mending a fence on the Morrison ranch. Old Morrison frowned and said, "Never seen anything hit like this. This morning he was running around. Now he's flat on his back. Can't keep a sip of water down." By afternoon, the bad news was running through town like fire over dry grass. The elderly began to collapse. Children burned with fever. Mothers hurried between the well and the sickbed, while men barred their doors, adding extra locks as though wood and iron might keep the sickness out. By evening, the town's only doctor, Yates, was down himself, drenched in sweat, shivering in waves. With no one left who knew how to treat it, Dryford felt suddenly stranded in the middle of a wilderness, far from any help. Naomi heard it from Cole when he came home. His eyes waited. He told her quickly what he'd learned. She was silent for a few seconds, then asked, "What are the symptoms?" "High fever, vomiting, diarrhea, exhaustion." "How long from first signs to the worst of it?" "Just hours." Naomi's fingers tightened on the hem of her dress, her gaze drifting far. Cholera. I've seen it before. If it isn't stopped quickly, people die. Fast. Cole looked at her, hearing something new in her voice. Not fear, but the cold certainty of someone who'd stood in the middle of such a storm before. In New Orleans? He asked. She gave a small nod, saying nothing more. The news didn't slow. By the next morning, the Dawsons had buried their boy. By midday, the Perkins family lost 2 more. The church bell tolled heavy and low, marking the deaths. The whole town shook. People kept off the streets, hiding behind latched doors and drawn curtains. Riding through the main street, Cole saw windows shuttered, heavy drapes blocking the light. In front of the general store, Mrs. Henderson wore a cloth over her nose, a bucket of wash water at her feet as she scrubbed the step. She gave him a quick nod as he passed, but said nothing. By midday, there were too many sick for families to manage alone. No one wanted to go near their neighbors, afraid of catching it. Houses with the ill left them lying in their beds, a basin of water set beside them before the door was locked tight. When Cole got home, Naomi was at the kitchen table with a stack of clean white cloths, several glass jars, and bags of dried herbs. The sharp bite of peppermint, the bitterness of willow bark, and the hot spice of dried ginger mingled in the air. I'll need more clean water, plenty of salt and sugar, and a big space for sick beds, she said, her voice firm. If they stay shut in their homes, the sickness will spread faster. Cole folded his arms. You mean to treat them? Naomi looked up, her eyes bright but steady. If nothing's done, they'll all die. In that moment, he remembered her tending Redwind, the focus, the confidence. But this was different. Saving a horse was one thing. Saving an entire town from a plague was another. I'll help, Cole said. The church is empty. We can make it a hospital. Naomi nodded. Good. And I need you to tell people. Bring the sick there. Those who are healthy can boil water, wash cloths, make beds. Cole pulled on his hat without another word and left. He knew getting the townsfolk to bring their loved ones to Naomi wouldn't be easy. Prejudice ran deep here, and fear would only drive them harder toward their old lines. By late afternoon, he returned with several men willing to carry beds from homes to the church. Naomi had already laid out clean cloth across the wooden floor, spacing the beds to slow the spread of infection. Windows stood wide, letting in the evening wind that carried the scent of hay and a thin, fragile thread of hope. The first patients arrived. A girl of about 10, eyes sunken, lips cracked. An old man shivering, breath shallow. A young man once strong lying limp, his hair plastered with sweat. Naomi moved from bed to bed, checking pulses, asking family when the illness began, instructing them how to mix salt and sugar into water and give it by slow sips. For the worst cases, she laid cool cloths to their foreheads, rubbed limbs to keep blood moving. Cole stood at the door, watching. No one here saw her as a wager's prize now. In the church, she was the one in charge, giving orders, setting tasks. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried with a clarity that made people listen. Outside, the light faded. The last of the day's gold washed over the wooden walls of the church, then darkened to the color of old brass. In that moment, Cole realized the real shadow over Dryford wasn't the storm clouds gathering. It was the fear blanketing the town. And yet, in the middle of that shadow, he saw something else. Naomi, standing alone, had become the one bright point people were starting to turn toward. Naomi knew exactly what she was facing. Cholera didn't just steal lives quickly, it planted fear deep enough to make people turn their backs on one another. In Dryford, with the only doctor laid out sick in his own bed, every desperate eye turned to her. The small wooden church at the edge of town had stood empty since the preacher died the winter before. Its windows were dulled with dust, pews stacked in uneven rows, cobwebs stretched from the Bible shelf to the pulpit. But to Naomi, it was the only space big enough for sickbeds with a roof strong enough to hold. She told Cole, "If we don't isolate them and care for them in time, there won't be anyone left standing." Cole listened and acted almost without pause. He'd been a logistics man during the war, had thrown together field hospitals in conditions far worse than this. He ordered a handful of able-bodied young men to haul out the pews, build rows of makeshift wooden frames, spacing each bed far enough for a caregiver to move between. He set up a trench line to bring water from the north well into large holding barrels. Outside, he rigged a washing station with soap and buckets, a notion most Dryford folks had never thought worth the trouble. Naomi mapped the space into wards, one for new arrivals, one for the recovering, and one for those in the worst condition. She used the stores of herbs she'd carried from New Orleans, mixing rehydration tonics, combining them with charcoal, and a disinfectant she made herself. The townsfolk eyed her, a black woman, giving orders like a head doctor. At first they hesitated, but their resistance weakened when they saw the first patients pull through the fever. Nights, Cole made his rounds of the improvised hospital, checking the trenches, the bed frames. He slept little. In the lamplight, Naomi moved from patient to patient, her hands deft with bandages, her voice low but firm. Cole saw those hands did more than tend wounds. They gave people a reason to believe they might live. One night, while he was checking the back door, the old man who served as night watch, a retired blacksmith, pulled him aside, voice rasping. "Before the sickness hit, I saw strange bundles dropped in front of a few houses, always the ones that had argued with Silas over land." The words slid cold and sharp into Cole's mind. Silas, Dryford's most ruthless land speculator, had never shied from dirty means to force a sale. Cole had suspected before, but never had a lead worth chasing. If the old man was right, this sickness might not be nature's work at all. From that night on, there was a new edge in Cole's eyes. Not just the strain of fighting an outbreak, but the hard glint of suspicion. He began noting the strange freight wagons that rolled into town, the faces slipping in and out of Silas's place, the low murmurs in the saloon. Naomi knew nothing of the suspicion growing in Cole's mind. Every scrap of her strength went to keeping people alive. She ate and slept in the church, dozing at a table made from an upturned crate. Sometimes, when exhaustion pulled her head down, Cole would set a blanket over her shoulders without a word and leave before she stirred. A week later, the death count began to drop. Patients were sitting up, even shuffling outside into the yard. The children, thin and pale, were laughing softly again when Naomi teased them. But Cole knew if this plague had a man's hand behind it, the quiet wouldn't last. It might have been in those days among the smell of bitter medicine and the sound of fevered breathing that he understood why Naomi was unlike any woman he'd met. She wasn't just strong, she was so steadfast she refused to give fear a foothold. And in that, without meaning to, she'd begun to pull him out of the shadowed distrust the war had left behind. He decided, once the sickness eased, he would find the truth. But first, he would keep Naomi safe. Because if Silas Crow truly had a hand in this, she, as both a savior to the town and a woman he was coming to care for deeply, would be the first target. In Dryford, rumor never needed proof to take root. Only the right words dropped into the right ear at the right time. Silas knew this well. At first it was murmurs in the saloon after nightfall. Then came the offhand comments from a woman standing outside the general store, weighing out sugar while letting her words fall like something said by accident. No one knows where she came from. Suddenly she's got medicine that cures the sickness. Strange, isn't it? Unanswered questions multiplied, seeping like groundwater beneath a town already thirsty for trust. Naomi didn't hear it all, but she felt it in the stares. They were no longer the grateful looks of those she'd saved. They lingered longer now, quieter, as if searching for cracks beneath her skin. Cole heard it. More than once, when he stepped into the saloon to buy supplies, the net of rumor tightened around him, drawn taut with every glance and half-heard word. One morning, before the sun had cleared the roof of the abandoned church, a group of strangers rode into town. Their horses blew hard, flanks slick with sweat. They weren't here for work or trade. They stopped in the square and spoke briefly with a local man Cole recognized, a former hand of Silas. From the church steps, Cole watched. He saw the stranger's eyes cut toward Naomi as she knelt, handing medicine to a thin, pale boy. One of them said something, and the others answered with a smirk. Cole knew that kind of smile. It was the kind that only meant violence had been given permission. That afternoon, the old night watchman came to Cole, his voice trembling, part from age, part from what he was about to say. Before the sickness broke out, someone had left small cloth bundles outside several houses. Every one of those houses had belonged to people who'd fought Silas over their land. The smell from the bundles was sharp, like dead flesh. No one had thought much of it then. But now, piecing it together, the picture turned dark. Cole was silent for a long moment. In the war, he'd seen tricks just as low, poisoning wells, seeding disease in camps. But this time, the weapon wasn't meant to win a battle. It was meant to clear the path for a man like Silas to gather up land unopposed. He wanted to tell Naomi right away, but she was running on days without proper sleep, every hour needed for the work of keeping people alive. Instead, Cole began quietly threading together scraps of information from anyone willing to talk. Meanwhile, Silas struck in the way he knew best, by planting fear inside a story told just right. He had his men whisper that Naomi carried charms from some far-off place, that she'd sprinkled them in the town's wells and only pretended to cure the sick, so folks would become dependent on her. He claimed he was worried for the town, afraid they were being bewitched into losing their senses. And hearing that, those who'd never believed cholera came from dirty water began to nod along. Fear spread faster than any sickness. It slid into houses, onto kitchen tables, into the eyes that followed Naomi. Hands that once clasped hers in thanks now pulled back. Whispers trailed behind her steps. A mother drew her boy aside when Naomi approached. An old man took the bowl of broth she offered, but refused to meet her gaze, as if afraid he might catch something unseen. Cole saw it all, and part of him wanted to shout, to take Naomi away before nightfall. But the soldier in him, the part that knew retreat sometimes meant abandoning the line, understood that leaving now would hand Silas the victory whole. That evening, with lamplight spilling gold over the church pews, Cole stepped into the back room. Naomi sat there mending a blanket for a patient. Her fingers were clumsier than usual, and he saw the way her mouth tightened at the corners. She didn't ask, but he knew she'd heard enough. Her hands stilled over the tear in the fabric, the needle hanging in midair. "If they believe that," she said quietly, her voice steady but weighted, "I can't save anyone else." Cole sat across from her, his eyes like cooled embers holding a trace of heat. He told her about the strangers, about the watchman's words, about the foul-smelling bundles. Naomi listened, and for the first time in weeks, she let the needle fall to the table. It wasn't fear in her face, it was anger, rising hot. They both knew now this wasn't just about fighting a sickness. This was a war for the truth, and the enemy was willing to turn the whole town into false witnesses for his tale. That night, inside the church, the coughs and fevered breaths of the sick mixed with the wind sliding through the cracks in the boards. But in one shadowed corner, two people sat facing each other, laying out what came next, not just to save lives, but to rip apart the net of lies tightening around Naomi. Outside, Silas might have thought he'd sown enough fear to last, but Cole knew poisonous seeds, when met with hands patient and brave enough, could still be torn out by the roots. And this time, he would not give up an inch of land or a single life without a fight. Cole didn't lay out the evidence in front of a crowd. He knew that in a town like Dry Creek, where rumor could kill faster than any gun, everything had to be put in its right place before the pin was pulled. He chose his moment when the sun was down, the red dust streets swallowed by darkness, and the town jail lit only by the weak yellow glow through a narrow window. Sheriff Hardy stood by the bars, holding a cup of coffee gone cold. Cole stepped inside and set a leather satchel on the desk. The sound of the lock snapping open was dry and final. From the bag he pulled several folded papers, shipping invoices from a warehouse in Tucson, along with the receiving slips from the Dry Creek depot. Silas's signature was clear on each one, neat and deliberate, as if he wanted everyone to know the goods were his. Hardy frowned. "You sure about this, Cole?" Cole didn't answer right away. Instead, he drew out a sealed envelope, its red wax already broken. Inside was a manifest listing the contents: several bolts of cloth, some wooden crates marked vaguely as medical supplies, and disinfectant oil. But the totals on the invoice far exceeded what had actually been received. "The warehouse guard says," Cole began slowly, "those cloth bundles were moved out the same night. No inspection. And a few days later, the sickness started." Hardy's eyes shifted toward the holding cell, where three strangers sat with their hands bound, eyes darting away. Cole walked over and set one of the remaining bundles on the desk. The rope ties were old, caked with dried mud. He took his hunting knife and cut them, and at once a foul stench rose, part stale sweat, part rot. The outer layer tore away to reveal cloth stained and blotched with yellow-brown patches. Naomi stepped through the doorway, just as Cole, wearing gloves, lifted the last layer. Beneath lay a crumpled sheet of paper, watermarked and sweat-stained but still legible, a map of the new railroad line. A red pencil mark cut straight through land owned by several families now reeling from the outbreak. All those plots, Cole knew, were already being offered for sale. To Silas. The air in the room thickened. Hardy exhaled hard, tapping the map against the desk as if to nail down the truth. "If this gets out, the whole town will blow." Cole nodded, his voice cooling. "If it doesn't, more people will die." Naomi's gaze fixed on the stained cloth. She knew that smell, the mark of fabric exposed to cholera patients. She didn't need a lab. only the memory of someone who'd stood in a field hospital before. One of the three prisoners shifted, his eyes flicking toward the window. Cole saw it instantly, stepped forward, and crouched to meet the man's gaze. "Who hired you?" His voice wasn't loud, but in the small room it struck like stone on stone. The man stayed quiet, glancing at his companions. Finally, he spoke, so low it seemed he feared hearing it. Himself. "We were paid to stir trouble. And if it came to it, take someone. A woman. Black hair, brown eyes. Said it was to stop the sickness." A chill traced down Naomi's spine. Hardy caught it at once, turning to Cole. "If they plan to take Naomi, that means Silas is ready to turn rumor into blood." Cole's hand tightened on the satchel strap. "Then we stay ahead of him. Tomorrow the whole town will know the truth. But we do it in a way that leaves him no room to strike back." Hardy's look mixed worry with agreement. "What's your play?" Cole rose, drawing the curtain just enough to let the lamplight spill outside. A small signal. "Tonight, I'm going to Silas's warehouse. If he's holding any more of these bundles, we'll have enough to hang him legal." Naomi stepped forward, her voice steady, but her eyes bright with fire. "I'm going with you. I can tell diseased cloth the second I see it." Cole started to refuse, but Hardy cut in. "Let her. She knows this better than anyone." Outside, the night wind carried dust and the faint tang of chimney smoke, but inside the room there was only the reek of infected cloth and the sense that a door was about to open, not to escape but to step straight into the heart of a scheme. When the three of them left the jail, their shadows folded into the darkened street, the only sound the soft knock of boots on weathered boards. In a place like Dry Creek, truth was never welcomed, but this time Cole knew they had no way back. Main Street in Dryford had never been this quiet, not even in the hardest winter days. The wind swept the dust across the road in thin, restless sheets at people's feet, but no one moved. The store, the saloon, the post office, all stood frozen in a scene tight enough to choke on. Silas stood in the center of the street, dust-caked boots planted firm on packed earth, his hands feigning ease while his thumb curled slightly over the grip of his gun. Behind him, 4 unfamiliar gunmen, sun-darkened faces, eyes narrowed to cold slits that only came from men who'd made their living by the mouth of a Colt, spread out, forming a line across the street. Every shift of their boots scraped the dust like sandpaper. Cole faced him from 20 paces, shoulders square, gaze steady. Beside him, Naomi said nothing, but her eyes were bright. Not with fear, but with the sharp awareness of someone who knew the way back had already been cut off. A few townsfolk clung to porch posts and door frames, watching in silence. Down the way, Sheriff Hardy appeared, walking slow, his hand hanging close to his revolver, as if ready to draw at a breath's notice. Silas raised his voice so the whole street could hear. He accused Cole and Naomi of using the epidemic to weaken Dryford, of plotting to take control and sell it off to the railroad company. His words pressed into the unease already simmering in the townsfolk, the ones who'd just come through sickness, loss, and hadn't yet found someone they could truly trust. A murmur rose from the left, some believing, some doubting, but all went still when Silas signaled one of his men forward. The gunman tossed down a thick envelope, papers spilling out, land sale contracts, signatures forged with careful precision. Silas stressed that these were proof of Cole's underhanded dealings. Cole didn't look down at the papers. He kept his eyes on Silas, speaking slowly and clearly, making sure people heard with their own ears, not through rumor. He reminded them about the diseased cloth bundles, the railroad map, and Silas's own signature on the shipping invoices. His voice wasn't loud, but it carved a stillness into the street, each word landing heavier than lead shot. Naomi stepped forward, her gaze sweeping over the faces wavering at the edges. She spoke of the days in the makeshift ward, of each patient she'd treated, of each life that had pulled back from the edge. Every word stitched over the rips Silas had tried to tear open with gossip. The air thickened. One of Silas's gunmen spat in the dirt, then laid his hand on his weapon. Behind Cole, several townsfolk, those Naomi had saved, began to step from the porches into the open, unarmed but with eyes that didn't waver. Sheriff Hardy moved between the two lines, his voice taut as a pulled rein, ready to snap if anyone made the wrong move. He declared this wasn't a trial, but if Silas had real evidence, it would be examined in public. And he said, plainly, anyone who fired a shot today would be branded a murderer. The wind pushed the dry scent of hay from the fields into town. One sheet of paper from Silas's envelope lifted, spinning between the two men before settling in the dust. Neither Cole nor Silas bent to pick it up. For a heartbeat, it felt like they stood at a crossroads. One wrong sound, and Dryford would turn into a killing ground. Then, from behind Cole's line, a sharp voice rang out. Old Mrs. Mildred, who'd lost her grandson to the sickness, but had also seen the cloth bundles brought from the warehouse. She pointed straight at Silas, saying he was the one who had brought the plague to Dryford, and she'd tell all if she had to. The murmur broke into a swell of noise. A few of Silas's men glanced at each other, clearly less eager to continue now that the townsfolk seemed to be leaning toward Cole. Silas's jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, but he held his tongue. Cole knew this wasn't the end, but also that Silas wouldn't pull a trigger here, not with the town beginning to see who truly wanted Dryford in his pocket. Still, the silence between the two sides stretched taut. One shadow moving too quick, one hand falling to a gun, and it would all break apart. Sheriff Hardy drew in a breath, lifted both hands, and spoke the one line he knew might keep Dryford on its feet for a few more minutes. Hands down. This ain't the day to bury each other. No one answered. But slowly, hands slipped from grips. Silas's crew backed away in heavy steps, leaving Dryford's main street as it had been, a dusty dead end, but one without blood on the ground. Cole and Naomi knew it was only temporary. Wind hissed through the gap between the two rows of wooden buildings on Main Street, sweeping up dust and scraps of old newsprint, spinning them before letting them fall. The people of Dryford still hadn't moved. Every eye was fixed on the stretch of ground between Silas and his gun hands, and Cole, Naomi, and Sheriff Hardy. Hardy drew a slow breath, then stepped forward, his boots grinding into the cracked, dry earth. He raised a sheaf of papers, evidence Cole had brought from the warehouse. Freight invoices, signatures, and sworn statements from families who'd received the diseased bundles. He read aloud, each line striking into the air strung tight as a fiddle string. We have proof of the transport of infected goods, bearing the signature of Silas Crow, and testimony from those who took delivery. A murmur rolled through the crowd. An old man leaning on a cane stepped out, his voice unsteady but clear. If not for Naomi, my wife would have died in that fever. She brought the medicine through the rain, even after being turned away. Then a woman stepped forward, a child in her arms. Her voice caught, but her eyes burned with anger. My family got one of those bundles. My boy nearly died. Naomi sat with him, changed his bandages hour by hour. If anyone says she tried to hurt Dryford, I don't believe it. Each word, each face stepping forward was a hammer blow against the wall of silence Silas had built. Cole kept his hand close to his hip, where his revolver waited, but his eyes slid toward Silas's men, gauging their shifting stances. Some began to change their footing, glancing at one another as if waiting for an order they weren't sure would come. Silas gave a low, mocking laugh, dragging the words out to keep the upper hand. Words don't buy anything here. Only strength keeps this land. That's when it came. A sharp, dry click. The sound of a hammer being drawn back. But it wasn't aimed at Cole. One of Silas's own men, tall and gaunt with a scar running down his left cheek, had swung his gun toward his employer. He didn't speak right away, just stared at Silas a beat longer, as if making certain there was no taking it back. Then, in a graveled voice, he said, "I owe Cole my life. 3 years ago, Canyon Ridge, he pulled me out from under a gang's guns. Since then, I don't shoot a man who saved me. And today, I won't let you shoot Dryford." The moment was like a bowstring snapping. Loyalty among Silas's crew wavered. Another man stepped back entirely, lowering his weapon. The last two glanced at each other, then quietly let their hands fall away from their holsters. Silas snarled, reaching for his gun, but faster than him, both Hardy and Cole had theirs leveled at his chest. Hardy's voice was hard as iron. "Drop it, Silas. Your game's done." For a few seconds, Silas stood frozen, eyes darting for an ally. But all had stepped away, leaving him alone. At last, he threw his revolver into the dust. The metallic thud rang hollow. Naomi said nothing, clutching the shawl around her shoulders. Her eyes swept the faces in the crowd, faces that had once turned away, now standing with her. Hardy stepped in and shackled Silas on the spot. The rattle of chains echoed down Main Street, and with each clink, the invisible grip that had held Dryford so long seemed to loosen. Cole looked toward the scar-faced gunman who'd turned on Silas. He gave a short nod, a thank you that didn't need words. The man returned it, then melted into the crowd, joining the townsfolk whose side he had now chosen. No one cheered. No one clapped. The silence was heavy, but it was the kind that comes when a town has just stepped out from under a yoke. A beginning, uncertain but free, for the moment, from Silas's hand. Cole let out a breath. Not relief, but something close enough to keep him steady. Beside him, Naomi stood straight, her gaze fixed on Main Street. For the first time since she'd stepped off that stagecoach, they weren't on defensive. From here on, things would be different. 3 months isn't long in the harsh West. But for Dryford, each day since the violence ended felt like a rainy season washing years of dust away. The old wooden church, once a place that only saw worshipers on Sunday mornings, now rang with children's laughter, quick footsteps, and the clink of water basins bumping together. A neatly carved sign hung above the door, Dryford Clinic. Naomi, in a gray cloth apron with her hair tied back, stood at the big wooden table in the center of the main hall where the pulpit used to be. Before her sat a boy of about 7, his hand blistered from boiling water. She cleaned the wound, smoothed on salve, and wrapped it in fresh white bandages, her voice soft as a summer breeze. The boy bit his lip, enduring it, but his eyes held trust, so different from the fear in her patients' faces during the first days of the outbreak. Cole leaned against the doorway, his Colt still holstered, but his hands busy holding a bag of medical supplies fresh from the freight house. The tautness he'd worn in the early days of standing against Silas was gone. Each time Naomi looked up, his eyes offered a quick, quiet smile. Since taking the job as deputy marshal and keeper of the peace, he'd done more than watch the streets. He arranged supply runs, oversaw the arrival of medicine shipments, and guarded the clinic like it was his own home. Outside, Main Street had changed beyond recognition. Houses once shuttered tight now stood open, windows wide, flower baskets swinging, or laundry fluttering in the air. Men mended fences and patched stable roofs. Women gathered at the well, their talk no longer edged with wariness over skin color or past misgivings. The children, who once kept their distance from Naomi, now played on the clinic's steps, tossing rings or running to the general store for candy. One afternoon, Naomi and Cole walked through the market. The white butcher handed her a bundle of beef bones for soup without charging her. The fabric shop owner greeted her like an old friend. Such gestures, small as they seemed, had been unthinkable 3 months ago. Cole realized this town now belonged to them both, no longer hers or his, but theirs. At night, the church-turned clinic still glowed with lamplight. People no longer hesitated to knock on the door for help. Some nights Cole returned from patrol to find Naomi asleep at the desk, hand resting on a stack of patient records. He'd pull a blanket over her shoulders, then sit out on the porch, lighting a cigarette, listening to the crickets, and watching the far-off lights of Dryford sparkle like proof of new life. The change hadn't come easy. There were still glances of doubt, whispers when strangers passed through and learned Naomi was a black woman. But unlike before, now when someone spoke ill, a Dryford resident would answer back. One old man, saved from fever by Naomi, told a visiting trader flatly, "Around here we don't weigh a life by its color." Cole had changed too. Once a man who kept to himself, trusting only his own hand, he'd learned that real strength didn't rest in the gun at his hip, but in the trust others placed in him. He spent more time at community meetings, listening to plans for mending roads and starting a school for the children. One Sunday evening in the town square, the people held a small celebration. Lanterns hung along the street, tables lined with cornbread, roast meat, and hot coffee. Naomi sat beside Cole, sipping herbal tea, eyes following the children skipping around the bonfire. A white little girl ran up, threw her arms around Naomi's neck, and murmured a thank you for curing her cough. Cole watched, and in that moment, every risk, every sleepless night felt worth it. When the gathering ended, Cole and Naomi walked back to the clinic. The night wind carried the scent of pine and hearth smoke, no longer the heavy, damp stench of sickness. Naomi said softly, "Dryford's not the same as the day I came." Cole nodded, saying nothing, and held the door for her. In the lamplight spilling out across the porch, their shadows stretched long over the earth. Two people who had come from different sides of life now standing together in the middle of a town they had saved. And though neither spoke it aloud, both knew this was only the beginning. Dryford still needed them, and they needed it, not just as a place to live, but as proof that even in the hard land of the West, a new kind of community could take root, one where folks stood as equals and looked each other in the eye without prejudice. That evening's sunset painted Dryford in a light like honey mixed with deep red, the kind of sky folks here knew meant autumn had ripened. Laughter, the fiddle's quick music, and the clatter of boots on boardwalks spilled from the square, where the harvest festival was in full swing. The scent of pumpkin pie, baked apples, and wood smoke wove together into an air as warm as an embrace, wrapping around the whole town. Naomi sat on the porch steps, her chair creaking in time with the gentle push of her feet. Cole sat beside her, one hand cradling a mug of hot coffee, the other resting loose on his knee, his gaze following the children chasing each other beneath strings of paper lanterns. Naomi's hair caught the last of the day's glow, burnished to a soft copper, and Cole caught himself smiling, not at any particular story, but because the moment itself was enough to make him feel he was exactly where he ought to be. "No one ever thought it'd turn out like this," Cole murmured, his voice mingling with the crickets in the grass. Naomi tilted her head toward him, a faint smile curling at her lips. "In the West," she said, "the best stories often start with something nobody wanted." Cole didn't answer, but in his eyes Naomi saw an unspoken agreement. She thought back to the day they first met, when trust was a scarce commodity and every look carried suspicion. Back then, Cole had been the man carrying a whole town's prejudice on his shoulders, and she had been the stranger seen as more danger than salvation. Now that distance was gone, replaced by the bond of two people who had walked together through gunfire, deceit, and the deepest kind of fear. Across the way, Hardy was retelling the story of Silas's capture to a group of young men, his hands cutting the air with each sharp detail. Laughter broke out, but no one had forgotten that once Silas's shadow had stretched over every rooftop in Dryford. The children darted between stalls, oblivious to that past. But the grown folks remembered, and that memory made them value every moment of peace they had now. Naomi's eyes found Mrs. May, the woman who had once refused to let her treat her boy, standing at the pumpkin soup stall. May gave her a small nod. Just a nod. But Naomi knew it was an apology. In a place like the West, apologies weren't always spoken. They were made in actions, in meeting someone's eyes without looking away. "How long do you think this town can keep it like this?" Naomi asked, still watching the children. Cole took a sip of coffee, letting the heat slide down his throat before he answered. "As long as folks remember why it changed, it won't go back. And as long as you're here." Naomi smiled, not arguing. She knew Cole wasn't flattering her, just stating a truth in the plain way he always did. Overhead, the first stars began to show, mingling with the lantern light of the festival. A group of teenagers wandered down toward the Confrontation river, their singing floating back like ripples on the water. The night air was cool, but the warmth from the porch, the coffee, and the man beside her made Naomi feel no chill at all. Across the street, townsfolk had built a wooden frame and hung it with photographs of Dryford. The church turned into a clinic, the first market days where black and white traders worked side by side, and one picture of Cole and Naomi standing in the clinic doorway, his arm resting lightly over her shoulders, her smile turned toward the camera. Those photographs stood as proof of a simple truth. Change didn't always begin with a crowd's decision, but with a few who dared to step forward. Cole leaned in, setting his coffee down on the porch step. "Naomi," he said, his voice low but steady, "ever wonder, if you hadn't walked into this town that day, how different things would be?" Naomi looked at him, then out toward the square where the lanterns swayed in the breeze. "I have," she said, "but I also think, if you hadn't believed me that day, it wouldn't have been much different." They sat like that, in a silence that needed no filling. The sky deepened, and the festival's light shone brighter against the dark. In a place where once a handshake between two different colors of skin had been deemed wrong, now those same hands lifted cups together, cut bread together, sang under the same sky. When night fully settled, Cole rose and offered his hand. "Come on," he said. "If we don't, Hardy'll be telling stories till sunup." Naomi laughed, placing her hand in his so he could pull her up. They stepped down off the porch, blending into the crowd in the square. The fiddle struck up a high, quick tune, and someone pulled them both into the ring of dancers. Cole wasn't much for dancing, but he followed the beat, and Naomi laughed until she couldn't speak. Spinning through the dance, Naomi thought, just as she'd once told Cole, that in the West, the best love stories often start with something nobody wanted. But the best part of them was when both people chose to stay, even when nothing was forcing them to anymore. And in Dryford, their story would be told for years, not as a rumor, but as proof that sometimes justice and love can live side by side, and when they do, they can change the heart of an entire town.